Okay, everyone, we are ready to go. Good afternoon and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Dennis Normile and I will be the moderator this afternoon. Before we get started, I hope you'll join me in double checking that your cell phones, your mobile phones are either turned off or turned to manner mode so that we don't interrupt the speech this afternoon. About 10 days ago, we had a guest here warning about the continuing dangers posed by the radiological contamination in the environment surrounding the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Today, we're going to hear the other side of the story. Our guest is one of the founding members of a group called Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information. This group, funded last year, believes that the fears of an impact on health from low doses of radiation are unwarranted, result from a misunderstanding, if not a misuse, of what's called the linear no-threshold model. Just a month ago, this group sent an open letter to a group of international bodies, including the WHO, the UN Science Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, trying to convince them that the forced evacuation and ongoing displacement of Fukushima area residents is having more adverse health effects than would be caused by exposure to the low doses of radiation that are currently found in the Fukushima area. The letter urged the bodies to assure Fukushima residents that returning to their homes would not increase their risk of cancer. And this would be controversial advice, but he's going to explain the scientific basis on which this group believes that such a reassurance would be based. Our guest is a Emeritus Professor of Physics at the University of Oxford. And with that, I'll turn it over to him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wade Allison. Is that comfortable?
Fine, thank you. First of all, may I thank the FCCJ for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak to you, and all of you for coming and listening. My friends in Japan who are helping and welcoming me again. It's the third time I've been. To friends around the world, we now have this cooperation group with no funding or anything like that, but lots of will and enthusiasm and belief to go with it. But let's start at the beginning. With 6,000 million people on the world, we need certainly energy and mutual trust. We know how working together in the last month we have seen that you can land on a comet. Working alone, we're just animals. Our real problems are socio-economic stability, water, food, and the environment. Radiation doesn't and shouldn't appear on that list. Indeed, nuclear and its radiation has no drawbacks, as I hope to show you or suggest to you, and it is an essential part of the solution. A decision to use nuclear energy has, in a democracy, to be accepted by the population. And if that democracy is going to be stable, then the electorate better be reasonably well informed about the decisions they're making. Now, this isn't the first time that we have had to make such a decision in man's life on Earth. An earlier decision to domesticate fire was much more difficult than the choice of nuclear energy today. Fire at home is really dangerous. Can you imagine what it must have been like when somebody said, you can see what fire does out there, and I actually intend to bring fire back into our house? And his wife must have been very angry and said it's incredibly dangerous. And of course she was right. And there was an environmental demonstration, no doubt, to save the environment and safety first and down with fire. But their houses were cold, their food was not cooked, they had a low standard of health, and those who did bring fire into their houses enjoyed the beginnings of the civilization that we see today. It's inconceivable that we could have decided otherwise. We then did have to go against the advice, the good advice, that it was dangerous. The difference is that today, the nuclear protesters have no good arguments for saying that nuclear is dangerous, and this is demonstrated by what happened at Fukushima and other accidents, as I hope to show you. So what did happen in March 2011? Well, I put it to you that three things happened. The first was that, of course, there was an earthquake and tsunami, a natural disaster in which nearly 20,000 people died. The second was that 3 nuclear reactors were destroyed. But there have been no casualties from that, and that was predictable, and it was not. It's called a disaster, but it's not a disaster. You cannot have a tragedy. You cannot have Hamlet with no dead bodies, not even a hospital admission. What was it? Well, it was followed by a local and worldwide panic caused by excessively cautious safety regulations and the total absence of a plan of what to do about a nuclear spillage like this, and a lack of education. And as a result of that, displacing people from their homes, particularly old people, at least 1,000 extra people have died who otherwise wouldn't have done. Food has been condemned, power stations turned off, fossil fuel imported, and severe economic damaged. And a reduced trust in society and science and medicine that would otherwise not have been the case. This, as I say, was an education disaster. What could have been done about that? Well, you know very well what is done about the threat of earthquakes and tsunamis in Japan, and that is a very good education, starting with children in school and training them, knowing what they've got to do, and the decisions are taken by individual people and school teachers what to do when the alarm goes. You don't have to wait until something comes from the United Nations to tell you what to do. You are pre-trained and it works. I understand that there were 500,000 people in the region that was subsequently inundated, and all except 20,000 of those were got out in the short time between the earthquake and the tsunami arriving. That is an incredible achievement. And it wouldn't have happened anywhere else in the world because we're not that well trained. That was bottom-up safety. In the nuclear situation, there was only paternalistic centralized international safety provided, which is slow to act, ineffective and scary, and nobody knew about it, and nobody understood. That's top-down safety for you. It's better to train people to take rapid on-the-spot action. The English story of King Canute, whose courtiers all thought that he could do anything and he was in charge and was the boss man, demonstrated that he couldn't stop the tide coming in and that science, the forces of nature and science have no authority over governments, UN, legal decisions and so on. Another recent example was the awful advice that individuals, children on the Korean ferry disaster should sit and wait until they were told what to do, with the result that they all drowned. A little more initiative, individual initiative in that case, and the death toll would have been much lower. Official advice suggests that radiation levels should be kept as low as reasonably achievable, which is called ALARA. That says nothing about safety and has no reference to natural biology. It's inherited from the Cold War days when people were frightened of radiation because of their association with nuclear weapons, is designed to appease. These are top-down suggestions coming from the UN that have resulted in public distrust of science, authority in general, and severe social stress, etc. All of this and the effect on nuclear safety was known as a result of what happened at Chernobyl. But unfortunately, nobody read those reports, those UN reports, World Health Organization reports in Japan. A positive experience of public experience of radiation should be built on clinical medical doses. And these have been in use to look after us all for over a century. Modern medicine uses moderate doses, 10 millisieverts, for diagnostic scans. In spite of scare stories, these are completely safe. In radiotherapy, daily doses of 200 millisieverts, that's 200 times bigger every day, are used with to kill the tumor with a few % chance of a new cancer arising. Doses are high, and in the tissue around the tumor gets typically 20,000 millisieverts over the space of a month. That's 20,000 years of what the regulations are advised would be a marginal safety for the public. And this is public experience. It's not coming from government labs or something that people don't trust. It's coming from their own medical experience. And millions of cancers are cured every year. Sometimes radiotherapy uses a source planted internally in the body, and sometimes it shines in from outside. But there isn't, that doesn't represent a significant difference. What about internal sources? I know that people in Japan, particularly housewives, are particularly concerned about the idea of a source of radiation inside their own bodies. Well, unfortunately, there is extremely good data on this kind of problem. In 1987, there was an accident at Goiânia in Brazil, where a radiotherapy source, so that was one that was used for medicine, of 50.9 terabecquerels. Now, if you're not used to dealing with big numbers, let me say that's 50.9 million becquerels, when, for reference, the activity limit for a litre of water in Japan is 100 becquerels per litre. So that's 500,000 million times larger. And this source was stolen from a redundant hospital by some scrap metal merchants, taken home, they broke it open, the children of the family played with it, they saw the blue light that the cesium was emitting, and they painted it on their faces, they got into their into the kitchen, on their food, and then they invited in their neighbours to see this exciting thing that they'd got hold of. They sold it to their neighbours, and it went to some other people, and in the end 249 people were very seriously contaminated. What happened? Well, 4 people died of acute radiation syndrome. This is not cancer, but it's when the cell cycle actually breaks down and the person dies because too many cells individually die, and the organism can't make new cells because the cell cycle's out of action. All those who died had more than 100 million becquerels. A couple had, who didn't die had more than 100 billion becquerels as well, or about 4,000 millisieverts. What has happened in the 25 years since that accident? Now, not a lot has been published, but I got hold of the doctor who reported in Vienna to the IAEA as recently as last March what the situation was. Nobody, not one, has died of radiation-related cancer in that time. Interestingly enough, one of the 249 people was a woman who was already pregnant. What happened to her? She had 200,000 becquerels. She was 4 months pregnant. She gave birth at the normal time to a child who, of course, was also radioactive. But it seems none the worse for that. So are all the animals at Chernobyl now. And if I have time, I can show you some wildlife pictures from the Discovery Channel, which shows how they're getting on. They're much better off with no humans around and being radioactive than they were when they weren't radioactive and had those terrible humans interfering with their lives. The question is, the scientific question is, why is radiation so safe? Because it is very powerful, and so that's very surprising. Well, the answer is that life is stabilized. That's the job that biology does, nothing to do with physics and chemistry. Life is stabilized and has been for over 4,000 million years. Any life form that did not look after the effects of radiation and oxygen, which does the same kind of thing, would fail. And like in engineering or electronics or management, a stabilized system is one that uses feedback, repair, replacement, regular inspection, adaptation to ensure that stress does not cause failure. And this curve is meant to show you that for small stresses, there is no failure rate. But beyond a certain amount, the system is overloaded. It has more stress than the mechanism can cope with. And then, of course, you do get failure. So all the methods that an engineer or a management team would put in place when there is a problem are used by biology to make sure that life can withstand small exposure to radiation. The initial radiation damage to atoms and molecules is quite indiscriminate. And in fact, more than half the body mass of our body mass is, as you may know, is water. And so most of the radiation damage is pieces of water molecules wandering around and causing trouble. These are called reactive oxidant species, or oxidants in the women's advertisements for what they put on their faces and so on. The effect of these oxidants is to attack further molecules and cause damage to DNA. So the effect of radiation is actually chemical in its mechanism, and protection against it is the same as the protection against the chemical effect of oxygen, which is what normally happens. And this includes DNA repair enzymes, antioxidants themselves, stimulation of the production of these, a process called apoptosis, which replaces damaged cells, immune surveillance, but immune surveillance, unfortunately, slows down with age, and it's people like me who are much more likely to get cancer than the children. We hear about cancer for children in the newspapers, but in fact, it's quite unusual, whereas it's not even noted when people die of cancer at an age. So there are two kinds of failure. One is when the cell cycle fails. For instance, in sunburn, you have a peeling skin when the cells of your skin are die from the effect of solar radiation, and when the whole organism fails, that's called acute radiation syndrome, like the 4 people died of at Goiânia. And then there's the long-term overload, which gives cancer when the surveillance by the immune system fails. I think I'm going to skip the next slide because of lack of time, and point out that what we're really talking about is a tortoise and hare race between a UN committee action which discusses things and has been for the last 60 years and introduces regulations but doesn't actually cure anything, and a system of evolution and curing of the effects of radiation put in place, which has been working for thousands of millions of years, and there isn't much doubt which is the better. So what are we going to tell people? Well, we can do what they want, which is to go and embark on cleanup and so on, but that's not really possible because you've still got to put the radioactive cleaned up material somewhere. You can remove topsoil, but if you do, that only reduces the activity of the countryside by about 50%, and it hardly seems worth it because it's immensely expensive to do, and the countryside that you're left with, which has no topsoil left, is hardly going to be useful for agriculture. So you end up with a situation with piles of topsoil, as I saw when I went there last year, waiting for somebody to take it away. Meanwhile, the woods and mountains remain as they were because they have not been cleaned up. Let's look at an example of how we should look at radiation. We should look at radiation in a relaxed sort of way. Let's consider when we go on holiday in the sunshine. The sunshine includes ultraviolet radiation. And the ultraviolet radiation, of course, is right next to X-rays in the spectrum of, in the electromagnetic spectrum. It's nothing like as efficient as busting molecules as X-rays are, but it does bust molecules, and when it does, it can cause cell death, which is the peeling skin of excess sunshine, and it can also cause cancer, skin cancer, which is very serious. In the US, there are 9,000 fatal skin cancer deaths a year. But we don't bring the whole of the US economic model to a grinding halt because of skin cancer. And in fact, we do much better with family discussion and advice. This, in fact, is a picture of a plastic bag provided by a high street pharmacy with some good, sensible advice for families on how to teach their children to look after themselves in the sunshine, which I think we can all identify. So we should take the same kind of attitude to nuclear radiation. And when we're on holiday with the children, we should take them round a nuclear power station. They'd find that very interesting. This is the sort of thing that we ought to do. But trust, the problem of getting people's trust, especially after a failure of trust like you've had in Japan, where can you get trust from? Or let's put it another way, who else has this kind of problem? Well, I'll tell you who has this kind of problem in spades, and that is the bankers. How do the bankers get trust for those grubby pieces of paper they sell us, they try to persuade that they're valuable, and hand it out in the form of banknotes? And I tell you what they do, as well as the most eminent statesmen and politicians put on there, they also put great scientists on there. But scientists are our people. If bankers can use scientists to give confidence, then we should be able to use scientists to give confidence in science. Let's take a few. Marie Curie, Charles Darwin, Florence Nightingale, Adam Smith, for example, and their 1988 Nobel Prize winner for literature, who says, "Fear does not prevent death, it prevents life." It seems to me that is a very profound statement, which I think. But all of these people identify that fear is something to be avoided and is thoroughly counterproductive. I'd like to, in particular, to look at the case of Florence Nightingale. I was brought up at school that Florence Nightingale was someone who wandered around looking after the soldiers as they died and writing letters home for them. Not at all. She was a rather distinguished statistician of her day. She collected data. And as I'll show you in a moment, she did something else which was quite new. She made diagrams with the data. So in the mid-19th century, she made diagrams which explained pictorially how the soldiers died. And she took those pictures and she shoved them under the noses of the politicians and the generals of the day, whose idea of risk was limited by what happened in the charge of the Light Brigade when a very large number of people were killed for no reason whatever. So can we follow Florence Nightingale, what can we do to explain what we're talking about in a pictorial form which we can show to people and shove under their noses? Here's a diagram in which areas represent monthly radiation dose rates, or the doses that you get in a month. Now, the red circle is what the tumor gets in a course of radiotherapy in a month. And that's fatal, that's why it's red, of the order of 40,000 millisieverts in a month. And the yellow circle is the dose that tissue nearby the tumor gets. And that's something like 20,000 millisieverts per month. This is in the absence of proton therapy. So this is all getting better with new technology. So this is what used to be or is currently the case. Inside the green dot is a green circle is a little black dot. And the area of that little black dot is the public limit, the ALARA limit, of 1 millisievert per year. And you can see how incredibly small that is. I'm suggesting, and my book has suggested, published in 2009, long before the Fukushima story, that safety is unjustifiably strict by a factor of about 1,000, and we should change to the green area as being the level that we consider safe. If you do that, you would not have required people after the first few days when the measurements were taken, but after the first 2 weeks, shall we say, everybody could and should have gone home at Fukushima. No power stations should have been closed. Well, that's perhaps a different subject. And no food should have been condemned. I don't have time to follow all these things through, but it's a massive, massive difference. I could talk about waste. Let's look at the CO2 waste that we produce each per day. It's represented by the size of these canisters. Perhaps the most serious is the 2 kilograms of biological waste we produce per day. Biological chain reactions are responsible for most of the fatal diseases in the world and produce millions of deaths every year, in spite of the fact that we teach our children about that very early on in their time on this earth. Nuclear waste, there is no chain reaction except inside the actual working reactor itself. And indeed, the nuclear chain reactions were all stopped at Fukushima when the earthquake came. By the time the tsunami came, the chain reactions had already been stopped. There was only the effect of the decay heat. And in fact, there are no chain reactions except inside the reactor. And there have only been about 50 deaths in 50 years, mainly from Chernobyl. And you can see that the volume is tiny. Nuclear waste is very, very small. The reason is simple. You don't very much fuel in nuclear fission reactor because it produces about 1 million times as much energy per kilogram as a chemical source of. So there's 1 million times less waste. It should be recycled and buried, and there should be less of a ballyhoo about it. It's not. It should be done properly. It should not be a big political threatening subject. I'm referring here to politicians and votes. I don't mean imply anything to do with what's going on in Japan at the moment. I'm just talking about in general. Let's look at the interested parties. The public are horrified at what's happening to electric prices, more or less around the world. The officialdom, supported by the advice of the UN, as shown in this diagram, is besotted with nuclear safety at any cost. Meanwhile, this causes high prices, high fossil emissions, enormous numbers of quite unnecessary modifications to reactors which were safe already, as Fukushima has shown. Meanwhile, the oil and gas, and I'd like to add biofuels to that as well, are taking in our cash without complaint. What's the nuclear industry been doing? Well, it's been happy to take in cash as well. If it gets cash for decommissioning nuclear reactors, it'll take the cash and decommission the reactors. But what it ought to be doing is operating and building plants to make the economy more competitive. What we need is a similar attitude to safety as with fire, and helping to educate people, not hinder. Oh, that hasn't come out right. Anyway, I think you will see this slide's on the handout, because and it is a coincidence, by a coincidence, on Monday, a business in Germany is now offering nuclear electricity as a special tariff. And that means that business in Germany, which has become very unhappy, not only about high prices, but the security of supply of that energy, can now buy nuclear electricity instead of, nothing wrong with renewables, but they're not there every day, or they're not there at night, or whatever it is. This initiative has been supported by a number of people around the world. You will see the first two of them are Greenpeace, significant Greenpeace authorities, or they were founders of Greenpeace. James Lovelock, whose name you may know, preeminent environmentalist. Bert Richter, who was a winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1976. Lord Smith of Finsbury, who was former chairman of the Environmental Agency in the UK, and Robert Stone, who is director of that excellent film Pandora's Promise. Anybody who hasn't seen that should do. It's written by people, green people, environmentalists who were anti-nuclear, and it explains why they have changed their minds. Well, that's really where I don't really like to end up with a slide which seemed to have gone wrong somewhere in the delivery system. But I'd like to stop at that point so as to make some time for questions.
Okay, thank you. If anyone did not find it, the slide in question is on the last page of the handout that you all got. We'll move right into Q&A, and we'll start with questions from the working press. Please keep questions brief and to the point. Come to the microphone as we're recording this for posterity, and give your name and affiliation. No questions from the working press?
If you don't, I will show some more slides. There's a threat.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schwering. I'm with German Television and Radio. I'm not driven by German angst, but if we're talking about cash, isn't nuclear energy just simply too expensive? Reactors are expensive to build, they are expensive to decommission. Nobody knows where the waste goes, which is expensive to keep. So why should we put any energy into building nuclear reactors and not, or simply force renewables flat out anywhere on the world? Thank you.
Well, I think renewables are important and have an important contribution to make. But the reason why nuclear is expensive is because of all this safety. It's because everything, every worker has to go through a screening every time he goes to work, all the work practices, all the contracts, everything is safety, safety, safety. I have challenged people who work at the, for instance, at the Sellafield location in the UK. What would happen, I said, if you didn't have to, what would happen to your productivity? And the answer seems to be that it would be about twice as productive. Reactors could be built in half the time. The Chinese are building them in 5 years. They can be much, much cheaper. You put less concrete in because you wouldn't need to run to the same. It's very difficult to persuade people that you need less safety, but when the safety you're getting is not actually helping anything at all, and it's making things very expensive indeed, then, of course, the conventional fossil fuel industry have been delighted that nuclear has got so expensive. And certainly the renewables do too. So I'm saying that there is no need for nuclear to be so expensive. And if we got confidence, and it's a matter of confidence, not only our confidence, but people's confidence in a democracy, we could make nuclear much cheaper. Of course, in the authoritarian regimes in Russia and China, they don't have to worry about this sort of thing anymore. And they're building nuclear power stations every week.
If I could, he also asked about waste.
Waste? Well, I think I did talk about waste at the end of my talk. There's very little of it. It should be reprocessed. Now, the actual optimization of fuel recycling and whether you use thorium and what you do about the uranium-238 and plutonium and so on. This is in part a commercial matter of what is the most financially advisable way of doing it. It depends on the price of ore and so on. And those are, I think, are commercial decisions, and probably a lot of different solutions will be made. But it shouldn't be a big problem. We don't treat the fly ash that comes from coal-fired power stations, or the CO2 even. We don't worry about that. Certainly we should be worrying about the CO2.
We're looking for the right place to bury this stuff in Germany for over
anywhere.
20 years now.
I know, but that's a lack of political will because of fear. Now, how long to, if you've separated the waste, fission products, that is to say, stuff that can't give you any more energy, its lifetime is, for half-life, is 30 years or so. In 500 years, it quickly becomes the same activity as the stuff you dig out of the ground. So you need a mine or a hole in the ground which is going to contain stuff for 500 years. But it doesn't have to be perfect. Here in Japan, people go to onsen and enjoy the effects of radioactive contamination of groundwater and in Germany they jolly well go to spas as well, and everybody's very happy to do that. But that's what they do on holiday. As I say, what you do on holiday somehow gets separated from what you do in the economy, and it shouldn't.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question right here.
I'm Rupert Wingfield-Hayes from the BBC. A couple of questions. One is, you just suggested just then that the nuclear industry should have less regulation because it's much safer than we think it is. But despite the regulations, Fukushima still happened. So how do you square that circle? I mean, Fukushima was built under very tight regulation, and yet we still had a triple meltdown. If there's more lax radiation, should we expect more meltdowns? And the second part of the question is, I've just come back from my 7th visit to the contamination zone. I take all your points about the exaggeration of levels of radiation, but nevertheless, the overwhelming response from people who live there or who lived there in the past is fear, and the overwhelming majority of people do not seem to want to go home even after the cleanup. So what do you say to them? How do you persuade them of your argument rather than the one that everybody seems to accept, that this is not a safe place to live anymore?
The problems of education take a long time, and after something like this, it's going to take a generation before everybody's happy that the whole thing is behind us. But when you say triple meltdown, where did you get those words from? Hollywood? I mean, there isn't.
Has there not been a triple meltdown in Fukushima?
Sorry, what do you mean by a triple?
It melted down.
Yeah, but so what?
You tell me so.
No, well, I'm telling you, so nothing very much. There was the fuel elements melted and fell to the bottom of the container and worked their way some way through the containment. They didn't come out the other side. At Chernobyl, of course, the whole thing blew off, and nobody asked what happened to the water, the cooling water there. Everything just went. And the death toll from Chernobyl is really very small by standards of major world accidents, where I would put the chemical accident in Bhopal. Yes, thank you. In India, it's more on the scale of Piper. It's smaller than Piper Alpha, and smaller than Deepwater Horizon. I can't remember what that was.
Deepwater Horizon. The well blowout in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. I can't remember what that was. But this, I see Hollywood large in what you're saying. Triple meltdown, well, so what? It's a mess. There are messes at Sellafield where accidents have happened in the past, and it takes a few decades to clean the thing up. But we don't bring the world to a grinding halt or change the way we get our energy as a result of an accident like Piper Alpha, for example. So I think the thing's got completely out of proportion. I don't say it wasn't an accident, I say it wasn't a tragedy. You can't have a tragedy if with, as I say, with no...
It's a tragedy for all the people who live around it, who can't go home.
But they should go home. That is entirely a consequence of the regulations. As I said when I came here last time, in October 2011.
Okay. There's a hand, the lady in the back. Yes. Yes, you, please come up.
Thank you very much. I'm just a lay person, so my question is maybe the point off, but I'd like to ask you.
I'm sorry, could you give your name, please?
But I'd like to ask you.
I'm sorry, your name, please.
Sorry. My name is Masae Kaizuka. Sounds like African warrior tribe. But Masae. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
And then, yes, may I ask you a question now?
Please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm wondering why the standard of the UN committee about radiation is so behind. And then also, I feel that in Japan, the very advanced study and research like you is not reported at all by mass media.
Well, on the last point, I agree with you. I think it's a great pity that you have very clever people in Japan. And there's a group in Japan, rather like SARI, that you've already heard about, which is working with SARI to try to bring these things, to bring these matters up. But as far as the UN is concerned, there are people like Mr. Baverstock, who was here, who've spent their career, their whole lives, their status, everything depends on on protecting us from the view of radiation that we all had for 60 years. And so it would be surprising if they were happy with what I'm saying. But what they are saying is not science-based as we now understand it. And that's not just coming from me, that's coming from the whole of the SARI group, and that is why we are addressing the United Nations committees. And there are an awful lot of committees. If you think whether there are committees that tell you whether your children should go out in the sunshine when they're on holiday, the answer is no, but that's much more dangerous and produces many more fatalities than nuclear radiation. And the number of fatalities at Fukushima was not reduced by implementing regulations.
Anyway, I know that the anti-nuclear people, their base of their saying is the research and the study of 40 years ago. I know that because I was in a member of the environmentalist group, and then
yes.
People are old, so they
sorry.
don't read the internet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Other questions from working journalists? Fujita-san. And please, a question, please.
Of course. But a bit of an explanation. My name is Fujita, and I'm at the Kokumin Shimbun. I have a data from the National Cancer Research Center, released 2011, and it's a cancer risk comparison. According to the research result, the 100 mSv is equivalent in between lack of getting enough vegetables and lack of physical exercise. 2,000 mSv is equivalent to drinking 300 cc of alcohol. And over 2,000 mSv is equivalent to smoking. That's the risk of cancer. So that gives the impression to me that once, not only 100 mSv or below, even 1,000 or 2,000 mSv is not as bad as smoking or drinking. My wife said stop drinking and smoking to me, knowing this research result.
The trouble with millisieverts is that's a dose. Now, if you have a dose of 20 aspirin and you take them all at once, you better book a taxi to the hospital right there before you start. If you take 1 a day or 2 a day, you may just cure your headache. That is, making this distinction is what is something that the LNT model that is spoken of, but I've tried to avoid speaking of because I don't think it helps anybody. That's what it's all about. What we've got to look at is the dose rate. Now, when I introduced my Florence Nightingale circle diagrams, that was the dose rate of 100 millisieverts per month. It doesn't add up because of these repair mechanisms. So over a period of a few hours, actually, because you can show in a test tube, most of the repairs are in fact cured in a few hours. But certainly over a period of a couple of weeks or a month, all of the damage that has been done will be repaired. And so you can then start again. So it's like almost, in fact, probably the same thing happens in smoking, because every time you smoke a few cigarettes, you don't get cancer, and your biology is probably working very hard to make sure that those cigarettes don't damage your health, but they may do. It depends on the rate. If you've given up smoking, your chances of dying of getting lung cancer fall dramatically. Certainly that's what the doctors tell us when they tell us to stop smoking.
Further questions? Dr. Allison, I have a question of my own. So I was amused that you put up Marie Curie as on your slide. According to Wikipedia, Curie died in 1934 due to aplastic anemia brought on by exposure to radiation. Is this not an example? I mean, she is brought up as one of the classic examples of what happens to someone exposed to doses of radiation that continue over time.
A horrendous dose of radiation when you think what she must have done, must have been exposed to over the period. She and her husband won the Nobel Prize for discovery of polonium, I think. Her husband was killed in 1906 by a traffic accident with a horse-drawn vehicle in Paris. She was not killed by nuclear radiation until 1934. And it may be that she was killed by radiation, but the amount of radiation she had would have been very large indeed, and I've never seen anybody attempt to quantify it. Incidentally, when she died, the safety regulation was about 734 millisieverts per year, about exactly the same, within a factor of 2, the same as I'm suggesting now, which now looks like a factor of 1,000 relaxation. It's the same as applied in her day. And that is thought to be about right by the doctors and biologists and so on who are working on in the SARI group.
Yes, over here.
Thank you very much, Professor Allison. I really learned a lot and enlightened. You mentioned about the political will to address this nuclear issue, safety issues.
I'm sorry, could you give us your name and affiliation, please?
Yeah, my name is Dr. Hamada. I'm a Japanese parliamentarian, a member of the Party for the Next Generations. And my question is that, how we could, form a unanimous agreement to proceed with these scientific studies on the effectiveness of a better use of the nuclear energy. And I am from the Tottori Prefecture, which is famous for the hot spring with the radiation. And the local people are very happy with the lowest rate of cancer because of this uranium a hot spring. So we'd better pay a more positive approach to make the best use of this available radiation nuclear energy. So what is your advice for the Japanese political will, how to cope with these new challenges? Thank you.
Well, I think we have to stop talking at people and we have to start talking with them. The way to get people's confidence is to look them in the eye, not dress up in lots of white suits and protective gear, wear an open-neck shirt, grip them firmly by the hand. Maybe these are English ways of doing it, but I think they would also work in Japan. We need people's confidence. We need to talk to children in school. We need to make sure that they know about radiation. We can do that with earthquakes and tsunamis. We do it with fire and tell children they mustn't touch that, it's hot. And sometimes they do, and then they learn and they don't forget it again. So we've got to have that kind of psychology. I think as far as the older generation is concerned, Keith Baverstock and co, or in my generation, it's much harder. But if your children go to school and they come back and you say, what did you learn at school today? And they tell you over the evening meal that they learnt about radiation, then you listen. More than you listen to politicians, you listen to what your children say and what they have learnt. So I think there are ways, I think we all have to work together, but I think there are ways of getting a cultural change. But given what's happening with global warming, I have to do these things quite quickly. Otherwise, the Chinese and the Russians are going to use this technology to make us uncompetitive.
We've come to the end of our time, but we'll take one more question. Yes, the lady down here.
Kyoko Hasegawa with AFP. Thank you very much for your speech. I get your point that fears over the radiation is bloated, but not a small number of people, including respected scientists, say, and I read somewhere, that there's not enough scientific evidence about low impact of a low-level radiation to the human health. It's a consensus, to my understanding, it's a consensus that there's no clear evidence that it's harmful at the level under 100 millisievert. But there's also no evidence that it has no impact on human health. So people's fear is based on that conflicting views among scientists. And how do you respond to those fears rooted in the lack of evidence? Thank you very much.
Well, we have now 70 years of experience with nuclear technology. We have over 100 years of experience of it in medicine, and you can't say that we don't know anything about it. The idea that special precautions have to be taken just doesn't wash. Nuclear is not especially dangerous. It's not as dangerous as fire, I suggest. But there are things, of course, that biologists are still learning. And it's important that they continue to do that. So there are scientific questions still to ask, but they're not so big that they affect safety and what we should do for the economic well-being of civilization as a whole. They may affect how we can use nuclear more effectively in medicine, and no doubt they will. So, have I answered your... answered your question. I'm agreeing with you academically, but sociologically and in the wider environment, I'm saying we already know enough.
If there is another question, will you take one more?
Of course. From you. Okay.
No. He's agreed to take one more question if anybody has a pressing question. Yes, back to the... Yes.
One of the things, when you go and talk to the nuclear refugees from Fukushima, one of the things they say is, look, we see the radiation monitors, we see the background radiation levels, and that's one thing, but they fear other things. They fear the dust on the playground. They fear the radiation in the water. They fear the cesium in the wood or in the mushrooms that grow in the woods. And they say, look, if we go back there, how are we ever going to know whether any of this is safe? We can measure the background radiation, but can we eat the food? Can we consume the mushrooms? Should we be worried about our children breathing in particles off the ground? Because they believe, I'm not a nuclear expert, but ingesting nuclear particles or radioactive particles is a completely different matter compared to just simply the background radiation. So how do you address that?
Well, I tried to address it, and only briefly today, of course, by telling you about the Goiânia accident, where people ingested very large amounts, and what happened. And as I said, some of them, a few of them, did die. Others, I didn't tell you, that they had serious burns to their skin. 28 of them had to have major operations, which they survived. But these are at much, much higher levels. And I have the figures that have been measured for whole body doses of the public scanning by the medical people in Minami-Soma and around the area of 32,000 people, and their activity has been measured, and you can compare that with what happened at this accident in Brazil, and it's between 1,000 and 10,000 times smaller. So one can be very confident that these people will not be adversely affected. They don't know that, and there is an enormous PR exercise to be done to get them to have confidence in that. But to walk backwards in front of their fear will get us in the same mess that we're in today. We've got to get out of it by telling people, and that's going to be a lot of work. This is not a Japanese problem. People say, oh, this is this is an especially Japanese problem. It isn't. These problems are the same all over the world. Everybody, every land has these misunderstandings and lack of nobody's told them about nuclear radiation. You just happen to have the tsunami and earthquake that started the thing. That's all that's special to Japan and the history.
Okay, on the note about getting back to work, let's bring it to a close so all of us working journalists can get back to work. As usual, I get the last word, and I would like to thank Dr. Allison. And also, I believe the honorary membership you got when you were here 2 years ago has expired. So I'll give you another 1-year honorary membership to the FCCJ. Thank you very much, and please come back.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming.